And this is Fintan Dunne reporting. You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. And thanks also to our sponsor as ever, neemwell.com. It's your personal source for potent Indian neem. And when I say potent, I mean potent. This stuff kicks. And if you're not already using neem, you can find out more at neemwell.com. That's neemwell.com. And another reason I like to say thank you for joining us is you are a pretty resilient bunch. You know that? Because I posted some of this deep stuff on Democratic Underground about the Plame affair being totally fake from top to bottom. And one of the posters there replied, look, if half of what you're saying is true, we are totally six-letter word ending in ED and starting with the letter F. And so I know the sort of stuff that we discuss here on breakfornews.com can be difficult for people to take on board who are caught up in the great deception. Regular listeners to this show have no illusions about the situation that we're in. They know that even the 9/11 movement itself is entirely a construction of the Central Intelligence Agency, along with a little help, of course, from their friends in the other intelligence agencies in the G8. So that can be hard to take on board. I appreciate that. And that's why I say thank you to those of you who tune in, because you're obviously a hardened bunch, is all I can say. This is the biggest group of optimists on the planet, the people who tune in to breakfornews.com. And anyhow, as we covered in the first episode of 9/11 Without Tinfoil, yeah, the song says Bush knocked down the towers, and it's right, but it's just the wrong Bush. It's not George W., it's George Bush Sr. And we covered that, and also the album cover by The Coup, a group formed in 1993, and the implications of that being that 9/11 was planned as far back as 93, and the Clinton presidency is a facade, etc. That was in episode 1. Now, I know some people are still reeling a little from that, especially those who are new to this analysis, that it could be that blatant that they could get away with that, get away with a fake Clinton presidency, and get away with foisting George W. Bush on us, and even better, manipulating us into thinking that it's George Bush's fault that all this stuff is going down. And you might be saying, could that really be true? How could they get away with that? Well, that's the power of television, isn't it? Because it's presenting you a certain vision of reality, political reality. And something happened yesterday, which was bad news for these boys, and which contains every element we need to track back and understand 9/11. 2 massive car bombs and a team of assassins failed to kill the Somalian president Abdullahi Yusuf Ahmed. And that was a very bad bit of news for the New World Order. On the face of it, it was supposedly pulled off by Al-Qaeda, because the southern half of Somalia is currently in the hands of Islamic insurgents, to use the old phrase, and they have defeated warlords backed by the US. In the last couple of months, they have defeated the US-backed warlords in Somalia. And now comes this assassination attempt on the president, which failed, as I say. And here's what, if you track back and start to peel away the layers behind this story, then you get a really good picture of what's going on in the world and why 9/11 happened. And guess who's involved? Well, the CIA. Hey, it's not just me saying it, it's the Observer in Great Britain saying it. Well, they didn't quite say it. Here's what they said on the 10th of September, the day before the 9/11 anniversary, when the Observer revealed that the CIA was engaged in covert operations inside Somalia. And the source for that were some emails which had been published by a newsletter called Africa Confidential. And those emails were emails from people in the military-industrial complex. That included a company called ATS Worldwide and Select Armour. And a Michelle Ballerin from Select Armour was revealed in these emails to be discussing freelance military operations inside Somalia with the knowledge and connivance of the CIA. And here's one little extract from those emails. She says, my contact, whom we discussed from the agency side, requested an in-person meeting with me. I arrived in New York at 23:40 last night and was driven to Virginia. Hey, driven to Virginia, meeting up with her CIA contact. And she writes also in these emails, successful meeting with the president. Hey, the president, this is the one who was nearly assassinated. So, successful meeting with the President and his chief staff personnel in Nairobi, Kenya on Tuesday, where he invited us to his private hotel. He has appointed his chief of presidential protocol as our go-to during this phase. Okay, so she's in touch with the President, and she's in touch with the CIA, and she's involved in this military group, Select Armour. Clearly, what we can draw out of all this is the CIA is doing their best to work with their ally, the current president beleaguered by an Islamic insurgency, working with him in order to defeat Al-Qaeda in Somalia. And they shouldn't be doing that because of UN rules, because they're messing around in the internal affairs of another country, and therefore that's very naughty, and so that's why, presumably, this is newsworthy. I hope you're hanging in there with me, because this is good. So that was the day before 9/11 anniversary. And by Thursday of last week, two totally unrelated things happened on the same day. Totally unrelated thing number one, I'm kidding of course, was that the controversy over the words of the current Pope about the Prophet Muhammad peaked on Thursday of last week. And even as that controversy raged, Reuters published 4 articles all about the fact that the US was facing terrorism threats in Africa from Al-Qaeda in Africa. 4 different detailed Reuters reports came out on the same day. I thought that was significant enough to flag it and to put it on the homepage of breakfornews.com, pointing out that the New World Order making their move on Africa. And then what happened on Saturday was that in southern Somalia, a Christian nun was shot dead by Islamic insurgents, supposedly perhaps Al-Qaeda. By the way, nobody has proof that these Islamists in southern Somalia are Al-Qaeda, but there you go. That's what happened on Saturday as a result of the Pope's comments. And now we have the Pope and Somalia coming together in the one story, tying us back in to those Reuters reports on Thursday and also to that report of CIA covert operations the previous Sunday. And then yesterday, the attack on the President. It was a very professional attack. The first car bomb went off at the front of the presidential convoy, stopping the convoy, obviously, and incinerating 4 or 5 cars, the first 4 or 5 cars. And as the President was rushed out of the presidential limousine by his security staff because the flames were engulfing it, a second car bomb struck, and there were also 6 gunmen on the scene. But despite all that, they failed to kill the President of Somalia. What had supposedly happened? Supposedly Al-Qaeda, these Islamic insurgents in the south of Somalia, had struck at the President. Had they really? I don't think so, because in the wake of their victory over the US forces in Somalia, those so-called insurgents were on the point of launching an international diplomatic offensive to reassure the world they're not like the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the last thing they needed was to make a preemptive strike at the President of Somalia and hand themselves in the process a huge propaganda defeat. So they had no interest in doing that. But if they didn't, who did? Well, let's just see. The Pope's role in this is interesting, is it not? We'll come back to him. But I wonder if President Abdullahi Yusuf Ahmed is just thinking to himself this morning, glad to be alive, and wondering if somebody set him up. Well, it couldn't be, clearly couldn't be the CIA. After all, we have that report Sunday which said that the CIA were working hand in hand with the President. So, couldn't be them, clearly. Or was that story deliberately planted 1 week before the assassination bid in order to establish in the minds of those who might read it that the CIA is working closely with the President? And so they would be, of course, the last people you would want to think about in terms of who set them up. Well, I think that's a perfect illustration of the way these people work, because that story was floated as a revelation. That story was floated as US accused of covert operations in Somalia. Bad news for the United States to have its actions in Somalia revealed. The truth is, the dogs in the street know that the US are working with the warlords in Somalia. That wasn't news of anything. That was a deception story planted by the CIA itself in order to establish in the public mind the closeness of its relationship with the President. The people who clearly had the most to gain out of this were the G8 and the whole war on terror crew. This hoped-for assassination of the Somalian president would allow them to portray Africa as the new frontier where they were facing an Al-Qaeda challenge. Just ahead of the elections in the United States, it would allow President George Bush to beat everybody to death with the global war on terror being vital. Those are the interests it would have served. the same interests who are pushing the Darfur crisis. So had the president been assassinated, it would have given them both Somalia and Sudan as clarion calls for a new phase in the global war on terror. So there you see the planting of a story a week before something happens. And it's a story that looks like it's a revelation. It looks like it's a breakthrough for revealing the truth, when in fact it's merely a flimsy cover. And the other event that's interesting here is the killing of the nun in southern Somalia just in advance of the assassination bid, and critically, the words of the Pope. What does that say about the Pope's involvement in all of this? Well, it says that the current Pope is just as much a tool of the interests who are acting behind the scenes as the last guy was. And it also confirms for you that George Bush Sr. is just as much in control of who gets appointed Pope as he was when he engineered the rise to the papacy of the first Polish Pope just in time to participate in George Bush Sr.'s plan for the ending of the Cold War with Russia. Why did he know the Cold War with Russia was going to end? Because George Bush Sr. has been working with the Russians for years. That's why you have Vladimir Putin, former head of the KGB, running Russia, and George Bush Sr., former head of the CIA, running the United States. Ever wonder why the Soviet military did nothing when the Polish regime began to fall? Because the deal was done. The famous collapse of the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the triumph of capitalism, was a staged event orchestrated with the help of John Paul II. How was this sold? Well, it was sold as a triumph over communism, and that's exactly how it was sold by Pope John Paul II. He had taken a principled stand that communism was a repressive system of human organization and had to be resisted with all the moral authority of the Catholic Church. And that's exactly the line that this Pope has in relation to the Islamic faith, that it is flawed fundamentally and has to be resisted with all the moral authority of the Catholic Church. They've just changed enemies as they changed popes. Back then, the target was Russia. The players were Reagan, George Bush Sr., and critically, pivotally, the Pope. This time, the target is the Middle East and Africa. Back then, the Berlin Wall fell because capitalism wanted to move east, and in order for that to happen, the wall had to be taken down. So why was it there in the first place? Because they were keeping the East on ice while they built up their economic and military power on the other side of the wall. As soon as they were strong enough, they took the wall down. Now that they feel they're even stronger, they're moving not east but southeast, extending the imperial empire down into the Middle East, and simultaneously targeting the other side of the Red Sea in Africa. But they do have a little problem. The rebels in Iraq, amazingly, incredibly, are proving a bit more resilient than expected, and the natives back in the United States are getting slightly restless. And the GOP is looking defeat in the eye, and they don't want to go down badly. Not really. So something's got to be done, and ideally it should start to kick in a couple of months before the election to change the climate, to change the emotional temperature, to move things back into a beleaguered type of psychology. And in order for that to happen, we had to have the events, including the controversial remarks by the Pope, which play into the games these guys play. If you already understand, which many people do, the manipulation of Christian groups in the United States and how important a power base that is to them, then you can see clearly why the manipulation of the broader Catholic community through the papacy is also one of their modus operandis. So, what kind of an outfit is it that can schedule the intervention of a pope on an issue in order to benefit a political party in the United States? Well, the same kind of an outfit that pulled off 9/11. This is the real world. And at this stage, you're probably realizing, there was a lot of truth in that old saying, the only hope is a pope who smokes dope. I think at this stage, it probably is. Let's hit the 9/11 evidence after this. This is Ben Watt and Attack, Attack, Attack. And it's about the old money forcing the world back like a tree laid across the tracks, forcing the world back. You're on the next level on breakfornews.com. We'll be right back. And you're very welcome back. You're on the next level on breakfornews.com. What do you think Did Bush knock down the towers? Right idea, wrong Bush. And that puts the whole 9/11 issue in a completely different context, a context in which the fall of the Berlin Wall makes sense, the move of the European Union into Eastern Europe makes sense, a context in which you can make sense of the decision by this international group, which has at its core George Bush, the most ruthless member, senior of the East Coast establishment in the United States. Yes, he's at the core of the power complex, but of course money talks, and money talks internationally. So it is a G8 operation, a consensus of shared interest, which pulled off 9/11. And would George Bush Sr. really sacrifice his own son to take the hit for all of the public resistance to the entire agenda going down in the United States at the moment? You notice it's not Jeb in the White House taking the heat. No, it's a dumb old George. You want to see who the real power is? Take a look at the Iraq Study Group, the membership of that elite group, a bipartisan panel who today said that the next 3 months are critical for Iraq's future, and they put it up to the Iraqi government to get their act together. What a nice piece of deflection of blame. And who are the members of that Iraq Study Group keeping their finger in the Middle Eastern pie on behalf of the East Coast establishment and thus the G8? Well, the list of members of this bipartisan group, the members are quite interesting, and indeed so is the chairmanship. Co-chaired the Iraq Study Group is by James A. Baker III. That's spelled T-U-R-D, and he was, of course, White House Chief of Staff to Ronald Reagan, among other duties, Secretary to the Treasury, etc. And the other co-chair is none other than Lee Hamilton, the man who was Vice Chairman of the 9/11 Commission. And the other members include Robert Gates, former Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Vernon Jordan, former advisor to Clinton, Edwin Meese is also a member of the Iraq Study Group, former Attorney General under Reagan, Sandra Day O'Connor, former member of the US Supreme Court, retired, Leon Panetta, former White House Chief of Staff to Clinton, William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, Clinton era, and finishing off with Charles Robb, the former Governor of Virginia, and Alan Simpson, former US Senator. That group, headed up by James Baker. That's where the power is. That's who's calling the shots on Iraq. And so that's why I suggest that when you want to start cluing people in on 9/11, start by explaining to them that they're focusing on the wrong Bush, and then watch the penny drop. That gives people a context in which 9/11 would make sense. And maybe it's a rude awakening for people, but hey, maybe that's what they need. Now, what about the specifics of 9/11? What elements of what happened on that day most inform us that it was an inside job? If you've already got people stopping and thinking about the issue of whether they're hating the wrong Bush, then it might be time to make them stop and think about something else that's undeniable, and it leads on naturally from the issue of the wrong Bush. If the Bush family, empire, dynasty would use George W. as a useful stooge, well, maybe the Bin Laden family would use Osama as a useful stooge. And why would you be bringing that up? Because the Bushes and the Bin Ladens are in business together, along with James Baker, by the way. And that's pretty undeniable. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's fact. The Bushes and Bin Ladens are in business together. Osama and George W. drew the short straw. Maybe you can see the line I'm taking here. I'm taking the KISS line, keep it simple, stupid. Simple certainly is going to work best in getting through to the average person, the man in the street, as they say, who isn't dumb. Now, he's maybe not interested in discussing the minutiae of the collapse rates of the 2 World Trade Center towers with you, but the average well-informed person can relate to straightforward information that's nice and straightforward and simple to follow. If people can get the wrong Bush idea and the Bush-Bin Laden idea, they'll definitely get the next idea. And that's the issue of why it was that the United States was not able to launch an effective defense against this alleged Al-Qaeda attack. And once again, we could go into incredible detail about at exactly what times different elements of the FAA and the Pentagon and NORAD knew what and when they knew it, etc., etc. But there is one glaring fact which is rarely mentioned and which plugs right into the issue of the wrong Bush. because it addresses Bill Clinton and the actions of Bill Clinton. No, not that controversy over whether he investigated Osama seriously enough or fought Al-Qaeda seriously enough. No, something else. Remember, Bill Clinton is a stooge of George Bush Sr. Now, let's come back to the day. NORAD had only 8 fighters on the East Coast for emergency scrambles on September 11th. They had overall 20 fighters. If you took in Canada, the United States, including Alaska, 20 fighters, of which 8 were available to them on the East Coast. Am I referring to the issue of how fast the planes flew? No. I'm referring to the actions of Bill Clinton for the last 3 years of his presidency. The principal reason there was no interception of the flights on 9/11 was not the issue of how fast fighters flew. It was this issue. For the last 3 years of his presidency, Bill Clinton oversaw the reduction of jet cover over the United States to a figure of 20 jets now, of which 8 were available, from a figure before Clinton oversaw this, a figure of 175 jets available to scramble over the United States 4 years before 9/11, reduced down to 20 by 9/11. Now that is some reduction. And it wasn't George Bush who did it. It was Bill Clinton who stripped the United States of its air cover. Simple enough for you? You can go research that yourself. It's easy to do, and we'll put some links to this material in the forum post that goes with this audio. Just click on the photo beside the audio to get to that forum post. But that's verifiable fact. That level of cuts is not reaction to budgetary pressure. Reducing the number of jet aircraft over the United States available for defence purposes from 175 to 20 for the entire of the United States and Canada and including Alaska. That's removing all effective air defences from the United States. And what next? Where did those terrorists practice to fly those planes? Florida. And so we're back to another member of the Bush family. Like I say, keeping it simple. And while we're down in Florida, we might as well take a look at the hijackers and this mysterious guy, Mohammed Atta, who was the lead conspirator, according to the FBI. Oh yeah, it's as we examine the hijackers that the whole story starts to fall apart, and you begin to see through the deception to what's really going on. This is Snow Patrol and Chocolate. You're on the next level, and we'll be right back. And you're very welcome back. You're on the next level on breakfornews.com. Now, to summarise a lot of what we've covered so far, it involves Bush, Bin Laden, Clinton, Bush. And you can write these down on a single line. Bush, Bin Laden, Clinton, Bush. And it tells the whole story so far, because you can put any 2 adjacent names together and they tell the story. Let's take the first 2, Bush. That's the fact that George Bush Sr. is the father of George Bush Jr. and he's the real guy running the United States, not the son. Let's take 2 more. Bush, Bin Laden. Well, that refers to the fact that the Bushes and Bin Ladens were in business together in the Carlyle Group. Let's take 2 more. Bin Laden, Clinton. That refers to the fact that Bill Clinton funded Al-Qaeda. Wow, on behalf of the United States government. Yep, under the Clinton presidency, Al-Qaeda was working with the United States government in Macedonia, in Bosnia, and in Kosovo, working for US interests. We'll be getting to that in a moment when we look at the hijackers. Let's take the next 2 words together, Clinton, Bush, referring to the fact that while Clinton was president, he kept Iraq on ice, using the no-fly zones and the sanctions to keep Iraq weak until such time as George Bush Sr. could come back in and complete the job as they're doing right now. And it also refers to the fact that Clinton was the guy who in the last 3 years of his presidency oversaw the virtual complete removal of the United States jet fighter air defense system. And then the last 2 words, Bush, take us from George Bush Sr. down to Jeb Bush in Florida, where the hijackers were based, and which we'll now take a look at. Bush, Bin Laden, Clinton, Bush. And now we're in Florida, which, by the way, was the only state in the United States of America to be properly prepared for 9/11. Surprising, isn't it? But it's true. On the Friday before 9/11, Jeb Bush declared a state of emergency in Florida ahead of 9/11. Maybe old Jeb had a dream or something. Yep, well, maybe he did. Maybe we all had a dream, because it's when we look at the hijackers in Florida that things seem to get really dreamy, and we start to move on to the next level of understanding of what's going on with the 9/11 operation. Now, let's pretend you're not an expert on Al-Qaeda, and hey, who wants to be? In which case, we'll just do the simple version of it, because it is fairly straightforward and simple. These guys were Al-Qaeda, we are told, infiltrating the United States of America and learning how to fly planes in order to crash them into buildings. And who are Al-Qaeda and where are they based? Well, over in Afghanistan. But weren't most of these guys Saudis? Well, yeah, they were. Most of these guys were Saudis, and many of them don't seem to have been the guys they were supposed to be, because people with the identities named as hijackers are still alive, so must have been some other guys, but in name at least, most of these guys were Saudis, and Saudis have a lot to do with Al-Qaeda. What happened is this: the CIA funded the Afghan rebels against the Russian army, and the Afghan rebels beat the Russian army. But they weren't the only ones fighting there, because the Saudis funded a lot of Arab Islamic forces, which fought alongside the Afghan forces and helped to defeat the Russians, although some of the Afghans weren't that keen on the Arab assistance. So there you have two groups fighting side by side, one funded by the CIA and the other funded by the Saudis. It's not the only money going around, though. There's also Pakistani money coming in to fund the Taliban. Okay, so now we've got three groups. A point to bear in mind here is that the United States of America has veto power over who gets appointed to key positions in Pakistani intelligence. What? A sovereign nation is told by another power who to appoint to its own intelligence services? Yep. And so, well, that would lead you to conclude that Pakistani intelligence is pretty much controlled by the CIA. In the case of 9/11, the source of the money for the hijackers leads us back into the Pakistani intelligence, and therefore the CIA. You see, Lieutenant General Mahmoud Ahmad, he was approved by the CIA as head of Pakistani intelligence, and he it was who authorized, reportedly, the transfer of $100,000 to that lead conspirator over in Florida, Mohammed Atta. Well, isn't that a bit of a red flag? Clearly this guy is deeply involved. He funded, reportedly, Mohammed Atta. So where is he? Let's get our hands on him. Well, you don't have to go far, because during the week prior to the 9/11 attacks, and indeed for days afterwards, Lieutenant General Mahmoud Ahmad was all over Washington, meeting with people in the State Department, intelligence committees, Porter Goss, Bob Graham, meeting with all the right people, including the CIA, in Washington, both before and after the attacks. The guy who reportedly wired those funds to Mohammed Atta. Did they haul him in for some waterboarding? No, they sent him back to Afghanistan to give an ultimatum to the Taliban to hand over Osama. And in a reshuffle, he was quietly dropped as head of Pakistani intelligence a short time later, and he disappeared into the memory hole. All of which is a bit suspicious, you'd have to agree. Even in the most favourable interpretation, if somebody was thinking along the lines that maybe the US government CIA had something to do with these 9/11 attacks, well, the evidence seems to be almost there in front of your eyes. This guy was approved by the CIA, and he's the guy who wired the money, reportedly, to Mohammed Atta. Now, here's where we start to move on to the next level, because I used the word reportedly a few times there. The report I'm talking about is one report. There was one report in the India Times, and it said that Indian intelligence had identified the fact that Mahmoud Ahmad had authorized the wiring of the $100,000 to Mohammed Atta. And there's been no follow-up on that. Just that one report. So all of my conjecture about the links between Lieutenant General Mahmoud Ahmad and Mohammed Atta rely on this one report from the Times of India coming from Indian intelligence. So what's going on here? Well, cast your mind back to where we started at the beginning of this audio, and that infamous report which came out a week before the assassination bid on the Somalian president. The report which came out in the Observer in London, saying that the CIA had been exposed as having been involved in Somalia, and you saw how in fact that was just the CIA covering their tracks in order to establish that they had a close working relationship with the Somalian president, which helps make sure that you don't start thinking that, hey, they organised to assassinate him, close working relationship or not, he was politically expendable for the broader goals of the war on terror. So there's a story planted in order to give you a certain impression. You think you're onto something that is informing you, whereas it's disinformation. And what I'm saying is that this Times of India report is the same kind of thing. So now you have to put your thinking hat on. Now it's time to move to the next level. Why is it that somebody is leaving that, rather it has to be said, insubstantial evidence, linking the lawmakers in Washington who met with this general right through the funds, through to Muhammad Atta? It seems like a red-hot link, but why is it being left out there? You see, it's the kind of link we half suspect, isn't it? A link between Washington lawmakers, this Pakistani general, and Muhammad Atta. But when you get right down to it, we've only got this one newspaper report to go on. So the question is this: why is somebody apparently letting you get in on this angle of the connection between Washington and Muhammad Atta? Why would they let you in on that secret? What is it that they're trying to hide that's worse than that? Now, hold that thought. Let's come back now to Florida and to this guy, Muhammad Atta. Very little is known about him during his time in Germany, and very little is known about him during his time in Florida, except from one person, his girlfriend, Amanda Keller. And what does she tell us? Does she paint a picture of a fanatical Muslim terrorist? No, surprisingly enough, she paints a picture of a sort of fairly well-to-do coke-snorting drug smuggler. Wow, what a story. Surely she's been on Oprah, or Larry King, or somebody. No. Okay, well, surely she's spoken to, well, Time magazine or Newsweek or somebody, Washington Post? No. No, in fact, she's only talked really to one journalist, Dan Hopsiker. Some of what she's saying, the stuff about the drug connections, seems to be confirmed by the people hanging around these hijackers and the areas and flight schools that they attended, confirmed the drug links. But as far as it goes in terms of her account of what Muhammad Atta was really like, we've only got that one journalist, Dan Hopsiker. Do we recognise this just one thing? Oh yeah, we covered that a moment ago, didn't we? The just one report in the Times of India that links the lawmakers in Washington to the Pakistani ISI, to Muhammad Atta. And just one journalist in Florida reporting on Amanda Keller's tales of what this guy was like. Are both of these the weak links in a flimsy chain which has been constructed, a chain of evidence designed to lead us along a certain line? What is it that they're hiding? Here's what they're hiding. They're hiding the fact that there were two 9/11 conspiracies, not one. You see, in a way, carrying off the perfect mass murder can be done pretty much as you'd carry off the perfect individual murder. Here's a scenario. It's like a movie plot, and there's been quite a few movies done along the lines of this kind of plot. Let's say I've got a competitor that I want to get rid of, but it's a bit well known that we're enemies. So the problem for me is that I would be the prime suspect if this guy goes down. So how to get around that and commit the perfect murder? Through my nefarious contacts in the wrong kind of bars, I arrange for 4 guys to break in to his house and thrash it. It's a bit of a sort of grudge thing, I tell them, and it's worth 5,000 bucks a piece if they do it, and there is no risk because I can tell them when he's not going to be there, so they can simply break in, thrash the place a bit and leave. It's an easy 5 grand. Who could refuse? They show up at the house, it's in darkness, there's no car there, and they kick in the back door and proceed to trash the place. Only problem is, I was there before them, about 20 minutes before, and I left 2 things. One was the murder weapon, the one I used to kill my competitor, who's now lying slumped over the steering wheel of his car about 5 blocks away. And the second thing I left was the bomb. And when it explodes, killing them all, they're not around any longer to tell their side of the story, and I've just created the perfect patsies. The police will find the murder weapon among their mangled remains. And if I or a screenwriter can think up that kind of plot, do you think the CIA are incapable of doing the same thing? Of course not, because that's exactly what happened. There were 2 murder conspiracies on that night. One was a simple one involving a break-in, and the other was a big one involving murder. The same applies in the 9/11 issue. There were 2 9/11 conspiracies. One was the half-assed, nebulous, flimsy, and lightly verified conspiracy that existed within Al-Qaeda. One was the conspiracy which involved those hijackers and this guy called Muhammad Atta. The totally separate conspiracy was that which was going on among key individuals in the power structure of the United States and in the core elements of the intelligence agencies of the G8. Now, the analogy isn't perfect, but the methodology used is on the money. In the murder plot, I want the police to think those guys had something to do with the killing that took place those blocks away. In the case of 9/11, the purpose of the leaked information about the connections between Washington and the hijackers and the activities of the hijackers themselves are all designed to make you think that those hijackers had something to do with what happened thousands of miles away in New York City and Washington. Well, they did have something to do with it, in the same way that extras have something to do with the making of a movie. And it's that dual conspiracy aspect that's most vital for helping people understand what happened on 9/11. Unless they understand the issue of two conspiracies intersecting, then they may get confused in a whole mass of Al-Qaeda detail that is, in the end, irrelevant. Much of these first two audios in the 9/11 Without Tinfoil series have focused on the central role of George Bush Sr. as the key power broker in the United States. But an event which took place just weeks after 9/11 is one which opens out the conspiracy to a wider international framework, and that is the accession of China into the World Trade Organization just weeks after 9/11. Remember, before 9/11 happened, one of the biggest news stories running for the previous 2 years had been the anti-globalization protests taking place across the world. George Bush Sr. in the United States intersects with the geopolitical interests of the G8 group of nations, the kind of people who have most of the power and money in this world, the kind of people who are in the G8 nations, the kind of people who sit on the Security Council of the United Nations, the global political intelligence and moneyed elite. And that's one other aspect that they're keen to hide. They don't mind too much if you think this was the neocons, George Bush Jr. and some traitors in the military-industrial complex. But it wasn't. This is much bigger than that. The global geopolitical event of 9/11 had a global geopolitical source, and a lot of that is detailed on the website. You'll find it in the articles about the G8 New World Order. But in the next episode, we'll be taking a look at the day itself and what happened on the day and what we can learn from that. I am and have been sketching out the core elements, simplified core elements of the 9/11 issue in these first two audios. Meanwhile, in the forum, the 9/11 3i inquiry is going through in detail each of the different pieces of evidence, whether hard or soft, that have become part of the legend of 9/11. We're picking through the bits and pieces of the 9/11 story to determine what's real, what's fake, what's smokescreen, what's deception. And we still have to produce a summary of that. We are late on that, just sheer pressure of time to do that. But we'll produce a summary of that 9/11 inquiry so that we can get an idea in one page of exactly where it's going and the sort of issues that it's looking at. And I'd like to thank again everybody who's participating in that. It really has informed us all, I think, me included, and helped put things in perspective. The discussion has been very, very useful in the 3i inquiry. And as these audios go on and as that investigation goes on, I think we'll end up with a streamlined, focused, simplified understanding of the 9/11 issue, which is much more straightforward to communicate to people. By the way, I would like to thank those who have contributed, and you can too. There is a PayPal button on the homepage of breakfornews.com. If you visit the site regularly and you tune in regularly, then you're on the next level. You know, I think the low point for those of us who have been active and activists in the 9/11 issue over the last 5 years, the low point was around the time and just after the time when we released the article identifying the CIA fakes. At that stage, a lot of people had yet to catch on, and there was a lot of confusion, and the months that followed until more did catch on were months of both confusion and disillusion. But what I've seen in the last few months is an increasing clarity as people begin to see through the smokescreen of disinformation and identify what is a straightforward story, a story which has now become one of ordinary people investigating a most extraordinary event. I don't know what we're doing investigating it, how we ended up in this position. I'm sure many of you feel the same. But here we are. let's do a good job. You have been on The Next Level on breakfornews.com, and I'll be back shortly with more. I do hope you can join me for that. But in the meantime, for breakfornews.com, this has been Fintan Dunne reporting.